Today we're going to be talking about one of the deadliest units in the United States Army throughout the entire First World War. This is one of the most forgotten units of the First World War, and that's primarily because it was composed of almost entirely African American soldiers. They were known officially as the 369th Infantry Regiment, but to history, they will always be known as the Harlem Hellfighters. The 369th Infantry Regiment started life out as the 15th Infantry Regiment for the New York National Guard. Now, the unit was constituted on June the 2nd, 1913, meaning that it was created on paper but did not physically exist. But then the regiment was actually organized on June the 29th of 1916. Now, this unit was the first segregated National Guard unit for the entire state of New York, meaning that the unit was created up of non-white soldiers. Now, this was a time in America where there was no war going on, so the 369th, or the 15th New York Infantry Regiment, as they were currently known, spent time conducting military training and drills, but these were all peacetime operations, nothing too serious. Fast forward to 1917, and three things happened that would change the destiny of the 15th Infantry Regiment. First, the United States entered World War I. Second, the Selective Service Act was passed, which allowed for African American and non-white soldiers to enter into federal army service. And third, the 15th Infantry Regiment was called upon by the federal government to enter into federal army service. So the 15th Infantry Regiment spent time at Camp Whitman, New York, conducting military training and formalities and things like that. They then were sent to Camp Wadsworth in South Carolina to conduct actual combat training, because they were destined to go overseas and fight in the First World War. At the conclusion of their combat training, they were sent over to France, where the unit was officially designated as the 369th Infantry Regiment of the United States Army on March the 1st, 1918. The 369th Infantry Regiment, being a colored infantry unit, suffered extreme levels of racism and discrimination during their time in Army service. This was extremely prevalent when the men were in Camp Wadsworth, South Carolina, doing their combat training. See, local business owners and shops were refusing to conduct business with black soldiers. After all, this was the southern United States, and we're not that far away from the American Civil War, so racial tensions are still pretty high in the South. One noteworthy instance was when Lieutenant James Reese Europe and Sergeant Noble Lee Sissel went into a hotel shop and were attempting to purchase a newspaper. The store owner refused to sell to the men on the grounds that they were black, and this caused quite a commotion. You see, some white soldiers from the 27th New York Regiment caught attention of this and stormed into the store and demanded that the shop owner sell to the black soldiers. After all, they were both New York infantry regiments, and racial tensions in the North weren't as high as they were in the South. Not discounting the fact that there were still racist laws against the men. The store owner refused, and a riot almost ensued, but thankfully, Lieutenant Europe, while actively being discriminated against, ordered the men to leave the business before violence ensued. This began a recurring trend of store owners refusing to sell to black soldiers, and then white soldiers refusing to patronize the stores themselves. They're quoted as saying, if they won't sell to our buddies, then they can just close up shop and leave town. Thankfully, the 369th Regiment was shipped to France after completion of their combat training. While in France, the racism unfortunately continued. You see, the 369th was a combat unit. They're an infantry regiment. All of their training has been based on fighting. But we can't have black soldiers dying in trenches next to white soldiers. I mean, the humanity of that. So they were used more as a labor unit for months, until the federal government decided what they were going to do with them. Imagine, you've got an entire regiment of men who are trained in combat. That's all they've trained for. and now they're being used for menial tasks such as picking boxes up and moving them to other locations. Thankfully, on April the 8th, 1918, the federal government decided what they were going to do with the 369th, and they were going to get rid of them. So the 369th Infantry Regiment was handed over to the French Army, and they were to be absorbed into French units and take command under the French Army. Now, the French soldiers were more than happy to accept them because France did not have the same levels of racism as America did during this time in history. So those soldiers were integrated into the French army, and America could not even give them equipment. They sent them over with their uniforms, and that was it. So the French army outfitted the soldiers with French helmets, French rifles, French belts. So if you find photographs of the 369th Infantry, which there are few of, you will see African American soldiers wearing American uniforms and French equipment with French weapons. Now, Uncle Sam couldn't just stop there. They even had a pamphlet secretly drafted up, and it was called the Secret Information About African American Soldiers. And they disseminated that to French citizens, warning them about the inferior nature of black soldiers and their tendencies towards racism. But the 369th Infantry was now fully integrated into the French army, and they were destined for greatness. The 369th, now fully integrated into the French army, entered the trenches on May the 8th, 1918. During their time in the trenches, the 369th were noted as being extremely fierce fighters, and they saw almost non-stop combat during their time in the trenches. They participated in the Second Battle of the Marne, and they quickly earned the respect of their French counterparts. They were referred to by the French as the Men of Bronze. But you see, the 369th referred to themselves by a new nickname, the Harlem Hellfighters, or just the Hellfighters. This is rumored because it's claimed that they found some German documents that referred to the men as Hellfighters, so that's the name they went with. And the Hellfighters fought ferociously. They were transferred to a separate French unit due to their fierce fighting reputation, where they were then sent on a 6-month deployment, the longest deployment out of any other U.S. combat unit during the entire First World War. Upon returning from their deployment, and after a much-needed break, on September the 25th, 1918, they would take place in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which was a massive assault on the German lines between the Americans and the French. And the Hellfighters were an instrumental role during this offensive. You see, during the battle, the Hellfighters began to aggressively fight their way through German-held territory. Now, the Hellfighters, so good at what they were doing, quickly began to outpace their French counterparts and quickly learned that it was just them by themselves. The Hellfighters single-handedly captured the strategic village of Séchault in France, and then upon doing this, they realized, hey, we're kind of out here by ourselves. We should probably fall back a little bit and reorganize with the rest of the men. On that day, the Hellfighters single-handedly took 8.5 miles of enemy territory. They were just good at what they were doing, and the French army absolutely loved the Hellfighter unit. The war would come to an end on November the 11th, 1918, but the Hellfighters, they didn't want to stop just there. You see, they wanted to be the first American soldiers to step foot into Germany. And that's what they did. On November the 17th, members of the Harlem Hellfighters crossed the Rhine River and became the first U.S. soldiers to step foot on German soil during the First World War. During the entirety of the First World War, the 369th Regiment the Harlem Hellfighters suffered over 1,500 casualties, which is more than any other US infantry regiment during the entire World War. The most famous soldier of the entire Harlem Hellfighter unit was a man by the name of Henry Johnson. You see, Private Henry Johnson was out on a foot patrol along with another private named Needham Roberts. Johnson and Roberts, while conducting their foot patrol, came upon a 24-man German patrol as well, and a gunfight ensued between the two men versus 24 other men. Henry Johnson instructed Roberts to run and alert the French while he would hold the defensive line. A few moments later, Roberts returned back to Johnson as he couldn't make it there. Both men were pinned down by enemy gunfire. Johnson and Roberts continued to hold the line and fight off the German army until a grenade landed in their position and detonated, incapacitating Roberts. Johnson, now in a foxhole with his wounded buddy, continued to single-handedly fight off the German army until he ran out of ammunition. Henry Johnson, wanting to defend his buddy, then single-handedly charged the German position with nothing but his bare hands and a bolo knife. Johnson is stated to have stabbed one German soldier through the helmet in the head and beat 3 other German soldiers to death with his bare hands. Johnson single-handedly fended off this German attack until the German soldiers, presumably because they're fighting Black Captain America, retreated. During this battle, Henry Johnson suffered over 21 separate wounds during this engagement. Johnson would be celebrated by his French comrades for this action, where he would get the nickname the Black Death. Henry Johnson was awarded the French Croix de Guerre, which makes him the first United States soldier to ever receive that award. It's kind of like a French Medal of Honor. Henry Johnson would go on to fight throughout the entire First World War and would return home. But due to racism and blatant politics, Henry Johnson never really received the credit for his actions, and he would go on to die in 1929 from complications of tuberculosis. Private Johnson's heroism and escapades would not be publicly acknowledged until 1996, when President Bill Clinton awarded him a Purple Heart. And then in 2015, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded Henry Johnson the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. Over 170 members of the Hellfighters received the French Croix de Guerre, as well as the entire unit receiving one by General Lebuc, who was their commanding general during the war. The Hellfighters also had a band as part of their infantry regiment, as back then it was kind of an important thing, and most regiments had a band. And the Hellfighter band was actually credited with introducing Europeans to the unheard of music style of jazz at the time. On December the 12th, 1918, the Hellfighters boarded the USS Virginia so they could go home. But Captain Henry Zigmeyer had them removed from the ship, as he stated no blacks had ever sailed aboard a U.S. battleship. The Hellfighters then made their way home back to New York, where they were welcomed home with a big parade, actually, in their neighborhood. Most black families took the day off work to welcome home this all-black infantry regiment who'd just been fighting. The Hellfighter band marched in the parade along with the men who marched down Fifth Avenue, being the first U.S. Army unit to ever march down Fifth Avenue in New York City. They marched back to their armory, where the unit was disbanded and reintegrated back into the National Guard. You see, the tragedy of this story is that most of the men who fought in the Hellfighters did so because they believed that by doing so, they could obtain equal rights from the government. I mean, they went and risked their lives for the federal government. Why shouldn't they get equal rights? But unfortunately, the US government did not honor their contributions and did not recognize them, and none of the men were granted any of the rights that they thought they were going to get. Most of the men were denied veterans benefits and could not even seek out treatment for the mental and physical wounds they sustained during the war. And most of their actions, like Private Johnson and many other men, would not be publicly talked about until decades after every single man in that unit was dead. You see, stories like Private Johnson's just show the heroism that men of the Harlem Hellfighters displayed during the First World War. And the sad part is that his is just one of a few. I'm sure there were dozens of incredible stories that were never written down, just simply because the men were black. The men's armory, the 369th, still stands on Fifth Avenue, New York, as a landmark and a tourist spot if you ever wish to visit it. And there is a statue in France that is put there to honor the men of bronze, the Harlem Hellfighters, for their contributions to the French army during the First World War. Most of the Hellfighters returned home to a thankless nation and never received credit for the things that they did. A few of the members of the band, such as Lieutenant Europe and Sergeant Sissel, had some mild success in the up-and-coming jazz scene, but nothing that they ever really deserved. And so many of the men of the Harlem Hellfighters all died thanklessly, and most of them from wounds they suffered during the war that they couldn't even get treatment for. So you see, I say tonight, let's have a toast to the men of the 369th Infantry Regiment, men who gave everything in the name of freedom, a freedom so sacred, so precious, that millions of men have died in its name. A freedom so amazing, a freedom that the 369th Infantry Regiment fought ferociously for, a freedom that none of those men ever received. Until next time, take care.